Hello, my name is Colin Blevins, and today I will be providing a book critique of The Nature of Leadership, Reptiles, Mammals, and the Challenge of Becoming a Great Leader by B. Joseph White. Quick note before we start, if you're all confused about the name of the channel I've uploaded this under, don't worry, it's just my name spelled backwards. I made this channel years ago. As for the structure of this whole thing, I'm going to be using prompts listed along the side of each slide. Basically, just little bullet points to keep me on track and make sure I don't ramble, as I'm unfortunately wont to do. So, before we really get into the critiquing of the book, as it were, let's get a brief sense about who I am. As I mentioned at the top of this, I'm Colin Blevins. I'm an introverted video game, anime, and book-loving soul who's taking this class in order to develop his leadership skills, so that one day I can create a brand new form of therapy. In terms of actual leadership experience, I really don't have a lot to speak of. However, based on the few times I have been in a leadership position, such as being a teacher's assistant, or the few times I've been in a leadership position at school projects, I tend to do best as sort of a second-in-command leader, someone who advises rather than directs. I'm hoping to change that, however, and I'm slowly coming out of my shell. Now, I'm sure some of you who have been in this class for any amount of time are a bit curious as to why I've never posted anything that resembles my face. Well, that's due to a bit of paranoia about my image being spread online and the fact that in real life I'm more of a private person. One last thing I want to touch on before we move on is the symbol you see to the right. I've been using that as my icon in class for better part of a few years now, and I'm sure some of you are at least a little bit curious. So this is a symbol from the game Monster Hunter, in particular a symbol of the monster Brachydios, which, if you're curious, is basically a giant T-Rex with boxing gloves that punches explosions. Yes, that exists. If you're interested, look it up afterwards. But for now, on to the actual meat of the critique. Here we have the bibliographic information of the book. It's just a brief overview of who wrote it and its special features. As you can see, this book was written by B. Joseph White, with some help from an alternate writer whose name, honestly, I have a terrible time pronouncing. I think it's Yaron Pruiz? Pruiz? I'm totally sure I'm mangling that pronunciation, but that's as good as I can do. The book itself consists of 7 chapters, with a survey at the end. It's bookended on both sides with a foreword and acknowledgement, and to add a little flavor, it has some limited illustrations, a couple of pictures of animals, and most prominently, a picture of a pyramid. We'll be getting into the relevance of that a little later. Opening up this book for the first time was an interesting experience in that it was quite unlike most other leadership books I've heard of. The writing style and language used within was a lot more personal and anecdotal than I was expecting. It prevents it presents a very relaxed writing style that addresses the reader directly, as if they were in more of a conversation with the author. The end goal is pretty obvious in terms of what the book is trying to accomplish. In fact, to illustrate that point, I'd like to read a quote directly from the book's very first chapter. My message is that whatever your starting point, you can become a leader, a better leader, and maybe even a great leader. The point that this is trying to make is to inform the exact what exactly builds to a great leader, the qualities, what is required, etc. As for whether or not it's suitable for graduates, I have to admit I'm not entirely sure. On the one hand, for someone like me who's on the autistic spectrum, a more concrete list of qualities, anecdotal evidence, and structured paths works well for someone of a graduate level who's just now trying to get into true leadership. On the other hand, I can see someone who's more experienced in leadership finding this book to be a bit of a slog and not really presenting them with a lot of new information. I'll go into more of my thoughts on those particular subjects later, but suffice it to say, whether or not it's suitable is more of a subjective point than an objective one. Finally, in terms of the questions I had going into this, it mostly revolves around how the animals featured in the title were going to play into leadership styles and roles. I wondered whether the book would go into how different animal social structures could inform better leadership styles, or maybe if certain leadership styles existed in the natural world. Now that we've kind of established my mindset going in, why don't we start our little journey and actually start looking at the contents of the book? Let's start with what the author is actually trying to say. From what I gathered with my time with the book, the author is trying to say that there are specific and oftentimes animalistic aspects of leadership that need to be incorporated in order to properly become a great leader. The author does this by taking each chapter and basically creating a miniature book filled with miniature chapters, all the while each chapter builds upon the previous one to create a greater sense of scale. Each one is filled with anecdotal evidence from the author's past and various examples of what the author is referring to, oftentimes using pop culture to better explain his point. Now, I'm not going to go ahead and explain everything he says because we both know that that would take an eternity, so I'll just briefly summarize the contents of each chapter. In Chapter 1, the author introduces himself and explains why he's writing his book, and provides a small bedrock to concepts he'll later flesh out in future chapters. In the second chapter, he details what he describes as the dichotomy between the reptilian way of thinking and the mammalian way of thinking, given the basics behind each of them and how they work together and/or conflict. The third chapter details the introduction of what is called the leadership pyramid, which is designed similarly to a food pyramid and states that in order to achieve true great leadership, what is needed is a good foundation, reptilian and mammalian leadership, and great leadership skills at the very top. The fourth chapter goes into great detail about the reptilian side of leadership, which mostly focuses on analytical, cold, calculating leadership, more logic-based, if you will. The fifth chapter, of course, then focuses on the mammalian side, which focuses on being nurturing, having good sense for people, basically the more warm emotional side of leadership. The sixth chapter focuses on great leadership requirements, things like being innovative, taking risks, and having an appetite for talent, which just sounds weird, honestly. And lastly, the final chapter details how to bring it all together by placing yourself in challenging situations and growing naturally with experience. To give a bit more context into where the author gets their expertise from, Mr. White will frequently detail his 25 years of experience both in leading academic institutions as well as being a manager in manufacturing and financial services. This is shown in numerous stories that are told by the author in order to reinforce specific points, as previously discussed. For a good example of this, the author tells a brief story about being the dean of a university for business in Michigan, attending a company picnic where there was a softball game done by the faculty. The teams were split up between the reptiles and the mammals, with the reptiles being made up the members of the faculty who were more involved with business and operations management, and the mammals being made up of communications and staff and ethicists. Man, that's a hard word to say. Not only did this whole debacle amuse the author, but it also provided him with the basis for what would later be this book, using the team names and the structures and applying them to metaphorical traits that we normally associate with those different types of organisms. Examples like this are all over the book, and as I said previously, it's structured in a way where each chapter sort of becomes its own self-contained book and builds off the information of the previous ones, with the obvious exception being the first chapter because there's nothing to build off of. Now, real quick, before we get into what leadership theories we discussed in class apply to this book, I want to take a quick moment to discuss opposing leadership and its basis, by which I mean bad leadership. You see, leadership naturally forms all the time. You can even see it in lower intelligence animals like chicken or fish. That's where we get the term pecking order, after all. However, as detailed in The Fragility of Individual-Based Explanations of Social Hierarchies, These types of naturally formed structures without any thought or planning put into them are more based on dominance rather than a kind of coherent skill. So moving up the food chain as we get into more complex forms and intellects, there become many more ways to structure and inform leadership, with the caveat being that it's often easier to develop bad leadership traits than it is to develop good leadership traits. To quote from Descriptive Literature Review of Harmful Leadership Styles, and quick side note, I have shortened the names of these journals because it is a mouthful to say otherwise. But getting to the quote, destructive leadership is defined as systematic and repeated behavior by a leader, supervisor, or manager that violates the legitimate interest of an organization by undermining and or sabotaging the organization's goals, task resources, effectiveness, and or motivation, well-being, or job satisfaction of its subordinates. The scariest part of that is that while the more toxic and destructive behaviors are just bad on their own, they can actually produce positive results for the larger corporation, leading to more abuse. I bring this up because while what the book touches on is important to know, essentially it talks about the necessary traits of leadership and when to apply them, it's equally important to know what specific roads you need to avoid, since you can still be successful while being a bad or destructive leader. With that out of the way, let's discuss the two theories that I think play very much into this book, which would be adaptive leadership and the trait approach. Now, to give you a few quick and broad definitions, adaptive leadership is a leadership style based on the idea that the leader will switch into different forms of behavior depending on the context of his surroundings and what individuals work under him or her. The trait-based approach states that there are a few specific qualities that a person can have or develop that make them, if not more predisposed, then give them much more skill at or inclinations towards being a leader. This is put on full display in the book, particularly in the last chapter, as the author heavily stresses that different job contexts will require that you rely more heavily on specific traits that you developed over the course of gaining experience. Put another way, the book details that you have to develop your leadership from a starting point of either the more analytical and logical side, i.e. the reptilian, or the more emotional side, the mammalian, and from there either develop traits of the opposing side, going back and forth as the context requires, or by staying with your specific strength and building up expertise in order to get to the great leadership skills. In this way, the book proposes sort of a chimerical fusion of these two ideas, developing the specific traits needed for scenarios that you will find yourself in and knowing how to apply those traits in those scenarios to benefit all of those who are working with and around you. Now we come to the final stretch, the recommendation section. Before we get down to brass tacks and whether or not I recommend this book, let's go over some quick talking points that I've alluded to earlier. First of all, what I initially wanted from this book was a more biological standpoint. As I've said, I believed I was going to get a book detailing how examination of leadership structures found in animals could benefit human leadership styles. That, of course, did not end up happening because the actual animal content of this book was more used in a metaphorical sense in order to more easily get across concepts and ideas. Honestly, at first I was a little disappointed, as I've always believed that one of the reasons mankind has gotten as powerful as it has is that it often incorporates techniques and ideas found in the natural world and uses it to its benefit. However, once I set that aside, I was pleasantly surprised by how easily and effectively the author communicated what they were trying to say, and I have to admit that the metaphor of reptilians as cold and logical and the mammalians as warm and emotional did resonate with me and make things a lot easier to understand. I myself have a similar concept in the works for a story I'm writing, but that's for another time. So overall, I quite enjoyed this book. However, that doesn't mean I think it's flawless. As I mentioned earlier, one of the great strengths of this book was that it addresses the reader in a much more casual tone, allowing them to be more engaged and feel as if they're in a conversation with the book writer. However, for someone with a much more analytical mind, I could see that quickly becoming a turnoff as the writer injects a lot of personal anecdotes which, while helpful for explanation, can tend to get a little repetitive. I also believe that while this book is great for beginners to leadership, or for those who have taken more of an advisory role in most groups, anyone of an intermediate or above level of skill in terms of leadership could become intensely bored and not find this helpful, as it presents a lot of basic information, much more so than more in-depth leadership books. However, none of the weaknesses that I've stated distracted from my enjoyment of this book, and for those who are like me and are starting to get into leadership, and would like a first stepping stone to ease them in, I can safely say this is a book I recommend. Check it out when you get the chance. Real quick before we end this off, I'm sure if you're curious and want to check out any of the sources I've used today, after I finish talking, I'll linger for a few seconds on the reference page. Please give it a perusal and check out my sources. And with that, my friends, we are at the end of my critique. All has been said except for one very important message, and if you've paid attention to my writings at all, you know what it is. Say it with me now. 3, 2, 1. Thank you for your time, and have a lovely day.